Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the Libertarian Angle on the issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be with you and to be again once more with our viewers and listeners.
Yep, if you're watching or listening to the Libertarian Angle for the first time, to come and visit us at our website at fff.org, where we disseminate ideas on liberty. Our mission is to present an uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, and we really do not compromise any aspect of the libertarian philosophy, because we believe that adherence to principle is everything when it comes to advancing liberty. Okay, Richard, I came across an article over the weekend in the Washington Post that talked about a photographer in the early part of the 1900s that became famous for taking photographs of children who were laboring in various factories and mines and other aspects of work at that period of time. And the article stated that those photographs played an instrumental role in getting legislation passed by Congress, outlawing or at least strictly regulating child labor. Now, you and I both know that we've grown up with this concept in economics classes in high school and in college about the horrors of child labor in America during the Industrial Revolution. And the implicit accusation really is that the American people at that time, or at least American parents, were bad people. I mean, that's the way I read it, is that these were bad people who really hated their children, they despised their children, and they were taking them into these factories and making them work long working hours, sometimes 70 hours a week in dangerous conditions, and that it took the state, the government, to correct this bad situation where you had these bad people raising their children here in the United States. But as we libertarians have long held, there's a completely different side of things here. And one of the main ones that played an instrumental role in my intellectual development here was Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek, when he talked about the Industrial Revolution, would point out that the comparison is wrong here. That what people are doing is comparing living conditions in the 1800s with living conditions today. And they're saying, well, see how horrible it was for these parents to send their kids into the factory. The really proper comparison, as Hayek pointed out, was between living conditions before the Industrial Revolution and those during the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, I mean, children were dying in mass. People were dying in mass. It's sort of like take the situation in North Korea today. I mean, there's people dying of starvation. When you have a very rudimentary society with no capital, no business, no economic prosperity to speak of, life's on the edge. I mean, you're living day to day, mouth to mouth. I mean, you're just finding something to eke out survival. And sometimes you just can't get enough, like food or clothing or shelter, to save everyone's life in that family. So along comes the Industrial Revolution, and yeah, things are still very poor, but suddenly there's business activity, there's capital accumulation, there's opportunities, and so that includes for the entire family. Now, here for the first time, people have a chance to survive and to have the entire family survive. But because the level of business activity and capital and prosperity is so small, it requires that everybody be working. So people weren't bad people who were sending their children into these factories. They were actually doing what was necessary to save their family. But over time, as capital accumulates, as business prosperity starts going up, then that's what enables wives to start staying at home with their children. That there's no longer necessary for the entire family to work. So it really is the level of economic prosperity that comes through capital accumulation that brought those children out of the factories, that brought women out of the factories and enabled them to stay at home raising their children. It wasn't the law. Because I guarantee you, Richard, any parent that is faced with a law that prohibits child labor and complies with that law, knowing that that child is now going to starve to death, and knowing that if he sends him into a factory, he's got a chance to survive, I guarantee you every parent's going to choose to break the law and save the life of the child. So it isn't the law that brought these children out of the factories and so forth. It was really the massive amount of capital and economic activity that was coming about through economic freedom during that period of time. What do you think?
Well, let me just sort of elaborate on some of the themes that you brought out. First, let us remind ourselves what life was like before the Industrial Revolution, everywhere, in every corner of the world, including Europe. And what we're basically talking about, to use that famous phrase from Thomas Hobbes, life was basically nasty, brutish, and short. Life expectancy was, if you were lucky, into the 30s for the average person. Starvation pervaded the land. Every land, everywhere. Plagues, failure of crops, wars and destruction. And just thinking about it is that when the 19th century was ending, when the 18th century was ending, that is, in the second half of the 1700s, virtually everywhere in every country, upwards of 85 to 90% of the populations worked in the rural areas related to the direct provision of food, that is, agriculture. Hours were long, from sunrise to sunset, in all types of weather. The standards of living were unbelievably low, of people eking out a living, with the uncertainty as to whether the rains would come or not come, whether there would be a drought, whether there would be excessive rain and flooding, whether the crops could not be successfully brought in, plagues, locusts, the fact that they had not developed the ideas of fertilizing and always the proper rotation of crops, so the soil remained able to continue bringing forth food. And that meant that children, from the time that they had their basic motor functions, had to go out and assist their parents in the fields, because the parents were not able to generate enough output by themselves often to be able to afford for their children not to be out in the fields helping them. In other words, at a very early age, children had to start pulling their own weight in terms of helping to produce the produce out of which they, as well as the other family members, were eating. Now this resulted, the Industrial Revolution resulted in a radical transformation of this. Government regulations, particularly first like in countries like in Britain, were loosened and began to be abolished on domestic enterprise. So there was ability to compete in previously restricted professions, occupations, and crafts. There began to be the ability to accumulate wealth, as you were saying, so people had the financial means to plow back, however small by our standards, then savings, capital investment. The ending of government regulations had the new age of reasonableness brought forth this great innovative creativity of the human mind. Mechanical devices, water power, the beginning of the use of electricity and steam, all of which meant that there were now these innovative ways for factory production, mass production of goods, and at decreasing cost, more of these mass-produced goods could be offered at lower and increasingly more reasonable prices for the growing number of the members of the society. To be able to do this mass production, this intensification of specialization in factory counts, it was necessary to have the requisite labor to be able to work, however much by our standards crude, industrial machinery. As a consequence of this, people began flocking from the countryside to the extent that they could do so to the cities. Now, nobody was brought to the cities in shackles, like a slave dragged to a pit. These people found it personally and advantageously desirable to make the trek from countryside to city. Why? Because however harsh, again, as you were saying, it may seem by our standards today, factory work was safer. You were inside, and therefore safe from the uncertainties of the climate. You didn't have to be outside all day in rain, in burning and exhausting sun. The elements in winter of whatever work needed to be done around the farm in snow and frost. You could now be in an enclosed factory, working in a sheltered area, and now you have a chance to earn more money and certain income than the uncertainties of rural agriculture. Now, children came along with their parents, and at first, productivity was low. The machines were crude. Output levels were very modest, again by our standards today, and to be able to feed all the members of the family, not because, as you were saying, the parents were harsher, crueler, less loving back then, but so the children could be generating enough wealth to help the family have the money to maintain themselves in their urban life. Now, was the work often monotonous? Were the machines sometimes less than perfectly safe? Yes, because the technologies were just being developed. There was a learning by doing of what was safe, what could be done effectively. Machines break down and injure the workers. Production is stopped for a period of time. It is not profitable to have injured workers who have learned the skills and the routines of that workplace and stop the production. You're losing man hours, you're losing skilled workers, and you're losing production. So there was no motive incentive to carelessly or inconsiderately do it. But there was just crude machinery as it's first developing. Before then, it didn't exist. Now, the other thing that brings, which is important, is that as the 19th century progressed, now it's the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, something that had never existed in human history, a thing called childhood. That's because people were too poor for kids to afford childhood. You're out, you're working. If you were like in the medieval villages, the son, as soon as again had motor skills, he was helping the dad as a blacksmith, as a carpenter. But once productivity started rising in the factories, because of the capital investment that made each worker's output more valuable, mothers and fathers were now earning enough that the children didn't have to be immediately sent out to work to help feed themselves. They could afford to have a time of education and play before they entered the world of work. And this became known as childhood. First, obviously, for those who were fortunate enough to get into the emerging and growing middle class. But even those that were, to use those often socialist type phrasing, the working class, that is those who worked in factories, in mines and so forth, even they finally began generating the sufficient income that their children too could defer when they had to enter that world of work. This is what capitalism produced. Now, again, to just hammer away, the laws began to restrict this, particularly in Great Britain, already in the early decades of the 19th century. This was viewed as the humane thing, the caring thing, the just thing, to prevent the cruelty, the insensitivity, the harshness of the employer, who sets aside an empathy for the child. But what were the children to do, given the low productivity and the low income? Not because of any cruelty of the taskmaster in the factory, but because output is just low per worker. You're not generating enough wealth per person that you can afford for children not to work. What was to be done if they had introduced full banishment of anti-child labor laws in those early and mid-decades of the 19th century, let me suggest that there would have been mass starvation of many of those who were young. The same phenomena occurs today in third world countries. Many people point to the, quote, the sweatshops of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for instance, where little children are working. Well, what is the alternative? That you want them to starve? That you want to have them live on the streets and scavenging for food in garbage cans? To, at a young age, girls or boys to have to try to make a living by selling their bodies to adults? Often those are the harsh choices. And in a country like Indonesia or African countries that have much lower standards of living, if you attempt to impose child labor laws on those societies, or impose high minimum wage laws set above any market valuation of what a child's labor might be worth in any production process, you drive them out of work. You leave them out on the street. You generate a growing unemployment for them and force them into illegal activities that are not only undesirable in general, but are immoral in terms of what they would force those children to do. That's the reality. And you would have had more of that in the 19th century. In Europe, certainly, in the States, it would have been imposed if such anti-child labor laws had been established. Poverty is the natural condition of man. Wealth is the exception that man over the last 200 or 300 years has learned to escape from through the institutions of markets, individual liberty, freedom to accumulate wealth, private property, freedom of contract, the incentives and proper opportunities of competitive markets. That has set loose innovation and improvement and rising standards of living that have slowly raised children as well as others out of poverty. Anything that would have hindered in the past or would hinder in undeveloped countries today from that continuing to develop, how slow and immodest it may seem at a moment in time from our more enlightened and further advanced perspective in a Western developed country, you'll be leaving those children to live a much harsher life than the beginnings or effective market opportunities are starting to give them.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by your line that said that poverty is the natural state and wealth is the exception. This is what so many advocates of child labor laws and so many advocates of socialism and interventionism and the controlled economy just fail to recognize. They take it for granted that a society automatically has wealth, and therefore, we can have these laws to pull children out of the poor working conditions and so forth. But actually, it's the exact opposite, as you pointed out. I mean, if you want to see the natural state of mankind, you can go to North Korea. I mean, where there's this mass poverty, where people do starve to death, children starve to death. To a lesser extent, you can look at Venezuela today, or Nicaragua, these so-called socialist havens. And the idea is that the more that government is involved in the economic activity of people, taxing them, regulating, controlling them, taking care of them with socialism, to that extent you're going to have much more poverty in that society. Now, if we go back to the pre-industrial revolution days, the principle is the same. Okay, the economic system varies to one of mercantilism, or during the Middle Ages, an agrarian type society, but in all these societies, government is playing a heavy-handed role in economic activity because people believed that this was a legitimate function of government. There was poor people, so you had poor laws that provided welfare for the poor. You had laws, anti-speculation laws that prohibited the poor from being exploited by middlemen and so forth, and speculators. And well, along comes Adam Smith, and I mean, here was the real revolution. That Smith says, you know what? You don't need any of this stuff. You don't need government taking care of people. In fact, people would be better off if government just stayed out of economic activity. And this was translated in the French as laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Just let it be, let it happen without government interference. it was a revolutionary notion. I mean, people were shocked. I mean, imagine a government not being involved in economic affairs. I mean, that would even shock Americans of today, because the federal government and state governments play such a heavy-handed role in economic activity, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, minimum wage laws, price controls, economic regulations. Well, Smith was saying, get government out of this entirely. And what really Smith did was he discovered the key to ending poverty. I mean, this is the grand contribution that 19th century Americans made to economic development, economic prosperity. Now, we know there was massive exceptions to freedom, the slavery, women didn't have the right to vote, and so forth. But in terms of economic liberty, these Americans proved that with economic liberty you can end poverty, or at least tremendously alleviate it, because you had thousands of penniless immigrants that were coming from around the world, desperate to save their families, save their children from starvation, and coming to a land where, yeah, they had to work 70 hours a week in these factories, including the children, but they had a chance to survive. And then over time, people start saving money, they start accumulating wealth. That capital, then they put it in the banks. That provides businessmen with the opportunity to borrow money to buy better tools, better equipment, making workers in their companies more productive. That increased productivity increases standard of living, real wages are rising. So you have this constant push toward higher standards of living, decade after decade, that finally enable people to remove their children from the long working hours in the factories, attend school, get educated, and so forth. But it's that capital accumulation along with free trade. I mean, when people are free to trade, they can improve their standard of living just through trade, because in every trade both parties are giving up something they value less for something they value more. So if you have a society based on principles of economic liberty and free trade in Venezuela today, or Nicaragua today, or North Korea today, yes, would things be difficult in the beginning? Of course, because it takes time to accumulate that base of capital. But then there's an exponential effect that the next generation gets a little bit better off, next generation even better off, and then it just soars and skyrockets, where people are enjoying very high standards of living. They're going on vacation, they can afford to, they're no longer eking out of survival, they're able to protest and demonstrate against government because they're not worried that about getting the meal that they need for their survival on the table. So everything improves as the standard of living of people improve, and that can only come about through capital accumulation and free trade that comes from the principles of economic liberty.
Yeah, the most difficult lesson that people find it hard to accept is that everything takes time. When you are already living a life relatively of ease, comfort, amenity, then the remaining elements or pockets or areas of lesser wealth, of poverty, stand out so starkly that people become impatient and irritated that, well, why isn't it solved yet? Some famous thinker once said that when the general condition of man is poverty, no one really objects to it because they view it as the natural order of things. It's only when people start escaping from poverty that an impatience emerges, that how can we sit by and just watch such terrible conditions exist around us? Why can't we just do something now? The problem is, it's like planting the seed for the hope of the fruit from a tree. The tree has to be planted. It has to take root in the soil. It has to receive enough nutrients, and it has to be watered properly. And more than 1 year may go by before the tree has sufficiently matured for the first crop of the fruit to start emerging on its branches. And then when the first people have these apples and they're enjoying them, but they're not enough to be able to feed everyone in a surrounding area, but some are enjoying it because they planted more trees, but still there isn't enough trees for everyone to be satiated with apples. There's a growing impatience. Well, why doesn't everybody have an apple? Why isn't there enough apples? Everyone leaves the day with a warm feeling in their stomach that the apples have eliminated the pangs of hunger. Something has to be done. But the only way to do that is to take the time and the effort, the saving, the industry, the investment to keep planting more apple trees. But each wave or each row of those apple trees have to first go through the same process of maturing and developing, and then they need to be properly cared for in growing rows of them to see that more and more people continuously can be satisfied with apples to eat. Now, that simple agricultural metaphor, if you will, that seems so simple as well as maybe to some simplistic, is the essence of all economic improvement. Yes, are there some children today and many others who live in terrible, abject conditions of poverty? But there are no easy solutions without setting up institutional barriers that not only slow down those countries' abilities from escaping from poverty, but involve the slowing down of continuing improvement for those from whom you're redistributing wealth and placing barriers of further improvement in front of them.
Yeah, you know, what really boggles the mind, Richard, is what life could have been like if the United States had stayed on the same trajectory. I mean, just think, in the 1800s, Americans discover the key to prosperity. No income tax. Everybody's free to keep everything he's earned. No mandatory charity. No Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, aid to dictators, and so forth. So everybody keeps his own money and decides what to do with it. Open immigration, people were free to come here, and essentially no restrictions at all, tuberculosis inspection or so forth, and no minimum wage laws, no price controls, and so forth. Very minimal economic regulations. And so this way of life, you know, provides the economic foundation that brings this tremendous prosperity. By the late 1800s, I mean, real wages were like doubling in a 20-year period of time. And then, you know, solid money, gold and silver coins, instead of paper money, fiat money, no Federal Reserve, no central bank. It was an incredible system. Imagine, Richard, what would have happened if that system had continued. The massive amount of capital that would have gone into society instead of into the welfare state way of life and the warfare state way of life. Imagine if we'd had solid money, gold and silver coins, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, instead of this plunder system where they debased the dollar and ran, you know, gold and silver out of the market, first by nationalization with gold, and then just bad money driving out good money with silver coins. I mean, it really boggles the mind what the standard of living would have been of the American people today. I mean, it's pretty good today. It would have been phenomenal if we'd gone through another century of economic liberty. Now, obviously, that's water under the bridge, but where do we go from here? I mean, do we keep on with this socialist variation known as the welfare state, the warfare state, the national security state, the IRS, the Federal Reserve, the massive income taxation, trade wars, tariffs, or do we get back on the right track and restore what Americans had discovered and what their great contribution to history is, this principle of economic liberty, which is the key to ending or tremendously alleviating poverty, bringing people out of the depths of starvation and so forth, and onto the reaches of tremendous economic prosperity. And obviously, that's what we libertarians are trying to do, is get America back on the right track.
We have to keep one thing in mind about this, Jacob. If we had had the continuing ideals of individual liberty, free enterprise, rule of law, limited government, that would have meant that people valued and believed in and understood those ideas. We would have been out of work. So the persistence of collectivism is a valuable make-works project for you and me.
That's true.
It means that we're unemployed. Oh, this is getting serious now, Jacob.
Yeah, that's true, which is why we want to advance liberty. We don't want to achieve liberty. You know, your point reminds me of that famous exchange between two of the founding fathers. I forget who it was, maybe Paine and I forget, but one of them said, "Wherever there is liberty, that is my home." To which the other one responded, "Wherever there is not liberty, that is my home." So
Yes.
you and I have been born in the society of the second one, where there is not liberty, and so our lives are devoted to achieving the free society.
So this means that our ideal is a totally laissez-faire free world, except for one country that will always need to be reformed by us so we have a job.
That's a nice cynical approach, Richard. Maybe we'll have to edit this part of the program out. Okay, on that note, we need to wrap things up. Enjoyed it as always, Richard, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next time, and thanks again to our viewers and listeners for spending a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, come and see us at fff.org. Thanks for your comments and your feedback, and of course your great support, which enables us to put on programs like this. And we'll see you next week at the Libertarian Angle.
Bye-bye.